Boss level begins by showing a man waking up from sleep at exactly 7 a.m. Just woke up. The man named Roy Pulver was directly confronted by a hitman named Mr. Good Morning. Surprisingly, Roy seemed to have no trouble overcoming the assassin's attack, even as if he knew every step and move taken to kill him. After successfully defeating Mr. Good Morning, a sniper rains bullets on Roy's apartment via helicopter. But Roy didn't seem upset and instead was engrossed in looking at a photo of a woman, who was his ex-wife named Gemma. Roy then manages to escape the helicopter attack and jumps out of the window before the apartment explodes and gets into the stolen car. A chase ensues when the next two hitmen, named Pam and Esmeralda, chase Roy's car. They shoot Roy, trying to incapacitate him. Roy was thrown out of the car and hit the bus's windshield and died on the spot. The scene changes by showing the same morning, at exactly 7 o'clock, and Roy wakes up again from sleep. Roy experienced the same incident, repeated attacks on Mr. Good Morning, and managed to incapacitate him before a helicopter fires at his apartment. Roy then jumps out of the apartment again before exploding into a chase with Pam and Esmeralda. He was apparently caught in a time loop, which saw him experience the same day from 7 a.m. to 12:47 p.m., by which time he would normally have died. Roy doesn't know what caused him to be stuck in a time loop and why so many assassins are after him. While stuck in a time loop, Roy has gone through 140 deaths in various different ways. He had died because of Pam 14 times, beheaded by Guan Jin, until facing Kaboom, who apparently often blows up his victims. Not to mention the many other assassins who seem to be asked to do various ways to kill him. Roy has tried various ways to get out of the time loop. On one occasion, he contacted his ex-wife, Gemma. Roy knew for sure that he was stuck in a time loop shortly after meeting Gemma, so he felt sure his ex-wife had something to do with it. But when Roy called, Gemma's boss Colonel Clive Venter answered the call and said Gemma had died in the laboratory due to an accident. In each time loop, Roy doesn't always lose to a hitman and die, before repeating the same day on the next day. One time, Roy managed to kill the assassins by blowing them up, so he had time to go to a restaurant to meet his two friends, who are the restaurant owner and a security system expert named Dave. While having a conversation with his two friends at a restaurant, Roy sees a woman named Dai Feng. Roy's time to have fun at the restaurant is not long because exactly at 12:47, he will die in various ways. The scene moves to one day before Roy is caught in a time loop. Gemma asks Roy to come to her workplace, Dino Labs, by pretending to apply for a job. Once they met, Roy and Gemma argued because their son only knew Roy as a family friend, not a father. On the other hand, Venter sees Roy near the highly classified project Gemma is working on and kicks him out of Dino Labs. Before Roy left, Gemma managed to get a body measurement and a hair sample taken secretly without Venter's knowledge. She then briefly hugged Roy before being pulled out by Brett, to the security of Dino Labs, and whispered the word Osiris. Venter summoned Gemma to his office and pressured her to immediately complete a highly classified project called Spindle Osiris, which she was currently working on. Gemma promised Spindle Osiris would be finished in 1 to 2 weeks, but Venter didn't believe it and instead suspected Gemma to have leaked the secret project to Roy. It was this suspicion that made Venter pay many assassins to kill Roy. The scene changes that night when Roy is dating a beautiful woman named Alice, who is a dentist. While being engrossed in the making out with Alice, Roy gets a call from Gemma asking for his help. Gemma said she couldn't explain her situation over the phone, but her voice sounded so frightened. Unfortunately, Venter had tapped Gemma's phone and immediately hung up before she could tell Roy what help she wanted from him. Gemma notices her phone being tapped by Venter and is seen rushing to put Roy's hair sample into the tube. At the bar, Roy is surprised that the call from Gemma suddenly goes off but does not try to find his ex-wife. On the other hand, Roy returns home and makes love to Alice. The next morning is the start where Roy is stuck in a time loop. The scene then back to the restaurant. While dealing with Dai Feng, who is preparing to kill him, Roy is reminded of Gemma's birthday gift, Iset and Osiris's book. The next day, Roy tries to read the book while trying to survive the attacks of the assassins. While stuck in the 142nd time loop, he tries another way to survive by going as far as possible to places he has never been. Roy goes to the basement of a building and spends time reading a book from Gemma. The Book of Iset and Osiris is about an Egyptian god who can avoid death and prevent the apocalypse. That's when Roy met a little boy named Joe, who apparently was his son with Gemma. Joe didn't know Gemma was dead yet, and Roy approached him to talk and then came out of the basement to eat. Outside the building, Roy saw that it was 12:50, which he lived 3 minutes longer than usual. He realizes that the assassins knew his location because of a tracking device implanted in his body. But because he was previously in the basement of the building, the tracking device lost its signal. But by that time, Roy was already outside the building, and one by one, the assassins came to try to kill him. Roy tries to protect Joe and sacrifices himself to die. Before he actually died, Roy had told Joe that he was his father. In the next time loop, Roy meets Dave at the restaurant to ask about the tracking device. Dave explains that the teeth are the ideal place, making Roy realize that Alice had a tracking device fixed on his teeth before they dated. Roy immediately ran to the bathroom to try to pull out his teeth. Just as he managed to pull out the tracking device in his teeth, a hitman came and killed him. After dying, Roy wakes up again at 7 a.m. and enters the 144th time loop. This time Roy rushes to meet Alice and manages to reveal that the culprit behind the assassin's assassination attempt is Venter. Roy then discovers that Venter is Gemma's killer. This revelation leaves Roy with a new goal, which is to avenge Gemma and kill Venter. Roy lures the assassins with his tracking device and kills them all one by one. After that he came to Dano Lab, but before he could enter, Brett had appeared and shot him in the head. Death was not an obstacle for Roy. In the next series of time loops, he came back to Dano Lab and tried various ways to get into the lab. After continuously failing to get into Dano Lab because he was always killed by Guan Jin, Roy went to Dai Feng and asked to be taught to fight with the sword. Roy went through a lot of practice with Dai Feng through a series of time loops until he finally returned to the Dano Lab and faced Guan Jin. This time, their fight was a draw, where Roy managed to beat and kill Guan Jin. He then kills Brett and incapacitates Venter in the fight, making Venter realize that Roy is going through a time loop because the Osiris Spindle project is secretly underway. Venter warns Roy that spacetime could be disturbed because the Osiris Spindle can continuously destroy the world. Before he was actually killed, Venter said that the targets of the assassins were not only Roy but also Joe. After killing Venter, Roy immediately went to find Joe, but it was too late. Joe was already dead. Right at that moment there was a big explosion because the Osiris Spindle interfered with space and time, which caused the world to end. Joe's death depressed Roy, so he let Mr. Good Morning continuously kills him until the 215th time loop. In the 216th time loop, Roy seemed to get a new spirit and decided to spend time with Joe. In the time loop at that time where he was still alive, Roy once again beat Mr. Good Morning, then rushed to the basement of the building to meet Joe. They spent time together before the explosion occurred and the world experienced an apocalypse. In the next time loop, Roy repeated the day again with Joe the next day. At one point, Joe told Roy that Gemma had called him that morning at exactly 7:03. He concludes that when he wakes up in the morning, Gemma is still alive, so there is a chance for Roy to save her. In the next time loop, Joe goes straight to Dano Lab and kills Brett and Venter. Unfortunately, at that time Roy found Gemma was dead, and based on CCTV footage, Gemma died exactly at 7:14. Roy repeats the same day in the next time loop, but this time, he hijacks the assassin's helicopter to rush off to Dano Lab. Not wanting to waste time rescuing Gemma before 7:14, Roy uses the minigun in the helicopter to kill all the assassins as well as Brett and Venter. Roy's attempt this time was successful and immediately brought Gemma in front of the Osiris Spindle to ask how to stop it. Gemma says the only way to stop the Osiris Spindle is for Roy to get into the machine, with the consequence, he will be blown to pieces. After that the world will be safe from destruction and the Osiris Spindle will be reset. Before entering the Osiris Spindle, Roy tells about his close relationship with Joe and says their son wants his parents back together. The boss level ends with Roy staring at Gemma before walking into the Osiris Spindle. The machine apparently crushed Roy's body into tiny particles, and this time he didn't wake up again the next morning. The moral of this film is don't let other people take your hair sample, especially if that person is an ex-wife who is also a genius researcher with the ability to make a time loop machine.